Amid the roar of war, two enemies aimed their rifles until a child's cry stopped everything. This is the true story of a British soldier and a German sniper who broke all rules of war to save one innocent life. A moment when humanity won, even as the world burned around them. It was late 1944, somewhere near a destroyed village in Normandy, France. The Allied forces were pushing German troops back, street by street, building by building. Every corner held death. Every shadow could be your last. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Rubble lined the streets where homes once stood. The beautiful French countryside had become a graveyard of shattered stone and broken dreams. Hidden behind a collapsed wall, Private Thomas Hale pressed his back against the cold debris. His uniform was caked with mud and blood, not all of it his own. His hands trembled as he gripped his rifle. 23 years old, from a small town in Yorkshire, he'd been in France for 6 months. 6 months that felt like 6 lifetimes. His eyes scanned the ruins across the street, searching for movement, searching for the sniper who'd been pinning down his unit for hours. Across that very street, high in the bell tower of what used to be a church, Obergefreiter Karl Müller lay perfectly still. His rifle scope moved slowly, methodically, scanning every shadow, every potential hiding spot. 26 years old from Bavaria, he'd been trained as one of the Wehrmacht's best marksmen. His orders were simple. Hold this position, eliminate any Allied soldiers attempting to advance. No retreat, no surrender, just duty. The tower gave him perfect visibility. He could see everything. The rubble-strewn street below, the burned-out vehicles, the bodies of soldiers from both sides who'd tried and failed to cross this killing ground. His breathing was controlled, measured. His finger rested near the trigger, ready to squeeze at the first sign of movement. This was his war. Cold, calculating, survival. Below, Hale wiped sweat from his forehead despite the autumn chill. He'd spotted the muzzle flash earlier, knew exactly where the German sniper was positioned. Smart bastard, he thought. Perfect line of sight. Anyone who tried to cross that street was a dead man. He'd already seen 2 of his mates cut down trying. Their screams still echoed in his mind. The battlefield had fallen into an eerie quiet. The larger assault had moved east, leaving this sector in a strange, tense limbo. Just him and the sniper. A deadly game of patience and nerves. Whoever moved first would likely die. So they waited. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The only sounds were distant artillery and the wind whistling through the broken buildings. Then, cutting through the silence like a knife, came a sound that froze both men where they stood. A child's cry. Soft at first, then growing louder, more desperate, more terrified. Hale's head snapped toward the sound, his breath caught in his throat. There, in the middle of the street, in the open killing ground between them, sat a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old, dark hair matted with dust, her dress torn and dirty. She was crying, her small body shaking with sobs, clutching a ragged doll to her chest. Next to her, motionless in the rubble, lay a woman, her mother. The child kept shaking her shoulder, calling to her in French, begging her to wake up. But she wouldn't wake up. She would never wake up again. Through his scope, Müller saw her too. His finger tensed on the trigger out of pure instinct, then immediately relaxed. His training told him to ignore distractions, to focus on the mission. But this wasn't a distraction. This was a child. A terrified, helpless child crying for her dead mother in the middle of a war zone. His mind flashed to his own sister, Emma. She'd be about this age now. He hadn't seen her in 2 years, hadn't held her, hadn't heard her laugh. War had taken him far from home, far from everything that mattered. And now here was another little girl, someone else's sister, someone else's daughter, about to die if someone didn't do something. Hale's jaw clenched. Every instinct screamed at him to stay hidden. Moving meant death. The sniper would take him down before he made it 3 steps. But staying meant watching that little girl die, whether from exposure, from artillery fire, or from crossfire when the fighting inevitably resumed. He couldn't do it. He couldn't just watch. His hands shook as he gripped his rifle tighter. His heart hammered in his chest. He thought of his own family back home, his younger brother who looked up to him, the letters he'd written, promising he'd come home safe. If he stepped out there, he might be breaking that promise. But what kind of man would he be if he came home having left a child to die? The girl's cries grew more desperate. She was calling for her mother, for anyone, her small voice breaking with each sob. Her doll had fallen into the dirt beside her. She picked it up, held it close, rocking back and forth like she'd seen her mother do to comfort her. But there was no comfort here, only death and destruction. Through his scope, Müller watched the child. His finger moved away from the trigger completely. He scanned the British positions, searching for movement. He knew someone would try to save her. Had to. Even in war, even between enemies, some lines couldn't be crossed. Some humanity had to remain. He found himself hoping, praying even, that someone would do something, that he wouldn't have to sit here and watch this child suffer. Hale made his decision. It wasn't rational. It wasn't tactical. It was simply human. He slowly set his rifle down against the rubble. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely unfasten his helmet strap. He took 3 deep breaths, each one possibly his last. Then, with movements that felt both too slow and too fast, he raised his hands above the rubble. Through his scope, Müller saw the hands first, then the helmet appearing over the broken wall, then the face of a young man, terrified, exhausted, but determined. Their eyes met across the distance. Through the magnification of the scope, Müller could see every detail. The fear, the resolve, the unspoken question, "Will you let me do this?" For a moment that stretched into eternity, Müller's crosshairs centered on the British soldier's chest. Perfect shot, center mass. His training demanded it. His orders required it. One squeeze and the enemy would drop, but his finger wouldn't move. Instead, something inside him, something that had survived years of war and death and horror, something fundamentally human, made a different choice. He lowered his rifle, just slightly, but enough. Enough to signal what words could never convey across this distance. "Go. Save her. I won't shoot." Hale saw the gesture, saw the rifle scope move away. For a heartbeat, he couldn't believe it. Then, moving on pure instinct and trust that defied everything war had taught him, he stood up fully. His hands remained raised. His movements were slow, deliberate, no sudden gestures, no threats. He stepped out from behind the rubble and into the open street. Each step felt like walking through water. His legs were heavy with fear. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to run back, to take cover. But he kept moving, one foot in front of the other, toward the crying child, toward certain death if the sniper changed his mind. Müller kept his scope trained on the surrounding area now, scanning for other soldiers, for any threat that might force him to make a different choice. His breathing remained controlled, but inside, His heart raced. What was he doing? This was madness. If his commanding officer saw this, he'd be shot for treason. But right now, in this moment, none of that mattered. All that mattered was this British soldier and this French child, and this brief moment of shared humanity in the midst of hell. Hale reached the girl. She looked up at him with eyes full of tears and confusion. She didn't understand his language, didn't know if he was friend or foe. She just saw another soldier in another strange uniform. But when he knelt down beside her, when he spoke to her in soft, gentle tones, despite not sharing a common language, something in his voice calmed her slightly. He looked at the woman's body, confirmed what he already knew. Too late to help her, but not too late for the child. He carefully picked up the little girl, cradling her against his chest. She was so light, so fragile. She clutched her doll tighter and buried her face in his shoulder. Her small body shook with sobs. Hale whispered to her, "You're safe now. I've got you. You're going to be all right." She couldn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. For the first time in what might have been hours or days, she wasn't alone. He stood slowly, the child in his arms, and looked up at the bell tower. He couldn't see the sniper anymore, just the dark window where death had been waiting. For a moment, across the smoke and rubble and waste of war, two enemies acknowledged each other. Not as soldiers, not as targets, but as human beings who'd chosen mercy over madness. Müller watched through his scope as the British soldier turned and began walking back toward his lines. Slowly, carefully. The child's small head rested on his shoulder. Her cries had quieted to soft whimpers. The soldier kept his movements steady, non-threatening. Even now he was trusting that the ceasefire would hold. It took everything in Müller not to look away. He kept his scope trained on the area, watching for any movement, any threat that might shatter this fragile peace. His finger remained far from the trigger. Other German soldiers might be watching. British soldiers certainly were. But right now, in this moment, the only thing that mattered was getting that child to safety. Hale made it back to the rubble, back to cover. He crouched down behind the wall, the child still in his arms. She was crying again, calling for her mother, but at least she was alive. At least she was safe. His fellow soldiers stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had. But he'd done it. He'd crossed that killing ground and come back alive. High in the bell tower, Müller finally allowed himself to breathe fully. He'd done it too. He'd let an enemy soldier walk away, had chosen a child's life over his duty. In that moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in months. Not pride in a kill, not satisfaction in following orders, but something deeper, something that reminded him he was still human underneath the uniform. He knew he couldn't stay. Other German units were nearby. If they'd seen what he'd done, questions would be asked. Difficult questions. Dangerous questions. He quickly gathered his rifle and equipment, took one last look at the street where a small miracle had just occurred, and silently made his way down from the tower. He disappeared into the forest beyond, melting into the shadows like the ghost he'd been trained to be. That night, huddled in a foxhole with his unit, Hale pulled out the small diary he kept in his pack. By the dim light of a covered candle, he wrote, "Today I met the enemy, not across a battlefield, not through a rifle scope, but in the space between us where a child cried. He could have killed me. I was defenseless. But he didn't. He let me save her. I don't know his name. I'll never see him again, but I'll remember him for the rest of my life. I met the enemy today and he spared me. He reminded me that even in war, some part of us remains human. Hale survived the war. He returned to Yorkshire, married his childhood sweetheart, had 3 children of his own. But he never forgot that day in Normandy. Never forgot the German sniper who chose not to shoot. He never spoke much about the war to his family. Too many ghosts, too many horrors. But sometimes, when his daughter would ask about his time in France, he'd tell her about the day he saved a little French girl, about the enemy soldier who let him do it, about the brief moment when humanity broke through the smoke. Müller also survived, though his journey was harder. He was captured by Allied forces in early 1945, spent 2 years in a prisoner of war camp, then returned to a Germany that no longer existed as he'd known it. He rebuilt his life slowly, became a school teacher in a small Bavarian village. He never spoke about his time as a sniper, never bragged about his kills or his service. But in his desk drawer, he kept a small worn photograph of his sister Emma, and sometimes when he looked at it, he thought about another little girl, a French girl he'd never met, whose life had been saved because 2 enemies chose mercy over duty. Years later, decades after the war, a local historian in Normandy was collecting stories from villagers about the occupation and liberation. An elderly woman shared a story her mother had told her about the day soldiers were fighting in the streets, about how her older sister had been caught in the crossfire with their mother, about how a British soldier had risked his life to save her sister while a German sniper held his fire. The historian was fascinated. Could this be verified? Could this story be true? She dug through military records, interviewed veterans, pieced together fragments from both sides. She found a brief entry in a British soldier's diary, donated to a museum by his family after his death. She found testimony from other British soldiers who'd witnessed something extraordinary that day. But she never found the German sniper. His name remained a mystery, lost to history like so many stories of the war. But the story survived, passed down through families, recorded in archives, remembered by those who understood its significance. No medals were awarded for that day. No commendations were given. The official records of the war barely acknowledged it happened. But it did happen. In the midst of humanity's darkest hour, 2 men chose to be human. They chose life over death. They chose mercy over madness. In war, enemies are taught to kill. From the first day of training, soldiers learn to see the other side not as people, but as targets, as threats, as obstacles to be eliminated. The machinery of war depends on this dehumanization. It's easier to pull the trigger when you don't see the person on the other end as someone's son, someone's father, someone's brother. But sometimes, just sometimes, that conditioning breaks. Sometimes something happens that cuts through all the training, all the propaganda, all the hate. Sometimes a child's cry reminds 2 enemies that they're both human, that they both have families waiting for them, that they both dream of a world where children don't die in the streets. That day in Normandy, the guns fell silent. Not for long, not for everyone, but for 2 men and 1 child, time stopped. Death held its breath, and humanity, battered and broken and barely recognizable after years of global conflict, still found a way to shine through. The little girl, whose name was Marie, grew up never knowing the full story. She had vague memories of that day, of being scared, of a soldier in a strange uniform carrying her to safety. But she was so young, and trauma has a way of clouding childhood memories. She knew her mother had died in the war. She knew she'd been saved. But she never knew about the German sniper in the tower, the enemy's soldier who'd chosen not to shoot, who'd given a British soldier the chance to be a hero. She lived a long life in France, raised by her aunt, became a nurse, spent her career helping others. Maybe in some way she was paying forward the mercy that had been shown to her. Maybe the ripples of that one moment of humanity spread further than anyone could measure. This is what war stories often miss. We remember the big battles, the famous generals, the turning points that changed history. But history is also made in small moments, in individual choices, in the split-second decision of one man to lower his rifle and another man to step into the open. These moments don't change the outcome of wars. They don't shift the tides of conflict. But they change something more important. They prove that even in our darkest hours, we can still choose to be better than the worst of what we're capable of. Thomas Hale and Karl Müller never became famous. Their names aren't taught in history classes. No monuments were erected in their honor. But on one autumn day in 1944, in a destroyed French village, they did something more significant than winning any battle. They refused to let war make them less than human. They saw a child in danger, and they both, from opposite sides, chose to save her. That choice cost them nothing in the moment, but it could have cost them everything. Hale risked his life walking into the open. Müller risked court-martial, possibly execution, for failing to eliminate an enemy soldier. But they both decided that some things are worth more than following orders. Some things are worth more than survival. Sometimes, the only way to win is to refuse to fight. The war ended in May 1945. Millions had died. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble. Families had been destroyed. Nations had been reshaped. The world had learned about horrors that many believed impossible. The Holocaust, the atomic bomb, the sheer scale of mechanized death that modern warfare could achieve. It was easy to believe, in the wake of such destruction, that humanity had lost something essential, that we'd crossed a line we could never uncross. But scattered throughout that darkness were moments of light, small acts of mercy, individual choices to be kind in a world of cruelty. They didn't make up for the horror. Nothing could. But they proved that even in the worst of times, even in the midst of history's deadliest conflict, human decency could survive. Love could survive. Compassion could survive. That day the guns fell silent for a child. Two enemies became, if not friends, then at least something more than killers. They became men who remembered what they were fighting for. Not conquest, not glory, not even victory, but for a world where children like Marie could grow up safe, where little girls could play with their dolls without fear, where mothers didn't have to die in the streets. This is their story, a story of a moment, a story that reminds us that war is made of individual choices, that every person in uniform is still a person, that sometimes, even in the middle of hell, an angel of mercy can descend, not from heaven, but from a bell tower, not with divine intervention, but with a simple human choice not to shoot. Remember this story. Remember Thomas Hale and Karl Müller, two names that history forgot, but whose actions deserve to be remembered. Remember that in war, the greatest act of courage isn't always taking a shot. Sometimes it's choosing not to. Sometimes it's stepping out from cover unarmed. Sometimes it's trusting your enemy to be human. That day, humanity won. Not the Allies, not the Axis, but humanity itself. For one brief, shining moment, we remembered who we are beneath the uniforms and the flags and the borders. We're people. We're parents and children, brothers and sisters, all of us trying to survive in a world that too often asks us to forget our shared humanity. The guns fell silent that day for a child named Marie. May we never forget why.